advice I give to folks that are putting together a plan, it's pretty basic. I guess it's put together a plan. You've got to have a plan that more than one person implements. To have a call down list of who to call and an idea of what are the priorities when you get there. Yeah, I guess the saving graces would be, just people, their kindness and generosity and wanting to help. And we had librarians across the state, reach out to us if they could come, anything they could do. Donations, they brought books. One library gave us some computers, desks, brought them to us, helped set anything up, and just a lot of people asked to help, and then they say in the future when we move back, they'll be there to help us.
I would advise you to safety your records, waterproof storage of documents. There's a lot to be said for cloud storage.
My advice to institutions planning for disaster is don't think that it's hard, because it's not. The resources are out there. They're on the web. They're among your friends. They're among your partner institutions. Reach out.
Just to remind you of the importance of leaning on one another. We're not islands unto ourselves. We really do need to work together. I can't harp on enough the emergency preparedness plan. No matter the size or scale of your institution or the work that you do, it really is key to have a plan like that in place.
What's next after you've experienced a natural disaster? You're on the road to recovery and you've gotten your business up and running. After today's session, we think you'll be a step closer to mitigating future damages to your organization based on what you've learned, experienced, and planned for, no matter what the disaster. I'm Bill Goodman, Executive Director of Kentucky Humanities, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Disaster Preparedness Online series. We're pleased that you've taken the time to join us for this important program, focusing on disaster resilience and the basic needs to consider as you develop an emergency preparedness plan. This series is made possible with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our thanks as well to our many partners, including Performing Arts Readiness, the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation, the Kentucky Historical Society, Kentucky Arts Council, the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives, and finally, to the men and women who have shared their remarkable real-life stories. We appreciate how your experiences will help others to learn about the importance of disaster preparedness. Now, I'll turn it over to our instructors for this session, Jan Newcomb, Tom Clareson, and Leah Hamilton.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Jan Newcomb with the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response. And I also wanted to say that today we have Elaina, Gregg from FAIC, who has been with us in the last of 3 sessions, and she was able to join us again today. So we have 4 of us. And I also want to thank you all for tuning in. And I know some of you have been on with us since the first one of the series, which was on readiness, and then also response and recovery. And today we're focusing on resilience. I'm, as I said, director of NCAPR, and I also want to let Elaina introduce herself and then the other instructors.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Elaina Gregg, the Emergency Programs Manager for the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation.
And I'm Tom Clareson, the Project Director for Performing Arts Readiness, based in Central Ohio.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Leah Hamilton, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky with the Department of Arts Administration.
So we'll start today's topic is disaster resilience and mitigation. preparing for the next time. And one thing we can tell you is there will be a next time. It may not be exactly the disaster we've had in the past, but we all have crises and disasters. So again, we want to thank the wonderful people at the Kentucky Humanities Council for pulling this together and for doing all the technical work, etc., that we've had going on. And I just want to tell you that you're going to see a lot of links and for information, and what they our good partners are going to do is put them all together, and you will have access to a downloadable packet of links that we talk about, and that should be going out on Friday of this week. So don't feel like you have to hurriedly try to figure out, oh, what was that? You'll be getting the proper links in the PDF, which will come out on Friday. So we had a little homework for you, and if you could use the chat to answer these questions. Is your organization involved in any collaborative disaster preparedness and recovery groups or networks? Because that's really what we're going to be talking a lot about today, is not only in the arts sector, but in the cultural heritage sector and the emergency response sector, how people work together in networks. And so we'd also like to know if you'd like to participate in a disaster network, as we're going to explain how they come together and how you can get involved. So we will move to the next slide after you answer in the chat. I just want to talk a little bit about NCAPER, because every chance I get, I try to talk about how we came together in 2006, really after the result of looking at the devastation after Katrina and also Rita hurricane. And National Arts Service Organization leaders and funders realized that there was no safety net for artists and arts groups following disasters. So they organized and became a coalition. Voluntary, they put their time and money into supporting all that we do, and really to focus on advocacy for preparedness, so that the entire art sector understands how we could be better prepared, and also to educate the sector on why. I think voices that we heard in the video were important, that they said, I love the one when she said, it's not hard. And I have run 10 arts organizations throughout my career, and I know how easy it is to say, I can't do one more thing. But believe me, this is the type of work that has to be in your toolkit, and it has to be developing. The best thing you could do for your organization is to develop a culture of preparedness from top to bottom. I was talking about NCAPER. You see 11 organizations on the screen. Well, you don't see them, you see the logos, but they kind of run the gamut. I mean, the grant makers in the arts, and of course we have the National Endowment, New York Foundation for the Arts, funds artists in need, actually throughout the country, in some of their granting programs. The National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, that's all your arts councils in the 50 states plus territories. Recording Academy Musicaires actually is the nonprofit arm of Grammys, and they have been giving individual grants to not just performers, but people who make the performances happen as well. So in front of and behind the curtain. And National Performance Network in New Orleans, and the Performing Arts Network, which is Tom's organization, and the Entertainment Community Fund, which used to be the Actors Fund, and they've been around for well over 100 years. And they as well fund and help individual artists, both who performers and the people who are working behind the stage. So on our next slide, some of the resources, and again, you will get these links, but NCAPER in its advocacy mode developed the Cultural Placekeeping Guide in 2015. It was published, and Tom's going to talk a lot about that, and how you in your cultural group, wherever you are, could form an entity using this guide. We also have some real practical things you see up on the left in Spanish, an arts field guide to federal disaster relief. And really what it is it was created to help demystify federal disaster relief. The thing is, when you're in the midst of a disaster, what you do not need is a government written document to try to understand how you're going to proceed. Believe me, this field guide, both in Spanish and in English, can be very helpful. And also during the pandemic, NCAPER actually developed a toolkit for organizations that were trying to figure out, what do we do? How should we keep going? How do we reopen? What can we do? And how can we present programming when we don't have audiences? And so there's some really interesting information in that, and especially keeping corporate knowledge alive, because we know how people move around a lot, and what you don't want is the kind of information to leave the organization. So it gives you questions and protocols on how to really maintain corporate knowledge, just as a note. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tom, who is going to delve deeper into the models of networks. Tom?
Thank you, Jan. And everyone, I just wanted to let you know that chat has been enabled, and we do have an answer or two in there. Amanda has mentioned that she is in a couple of networks that have existed and then have been on a downswing a little bit, and she'd like to continue to be involved in those. If you are involved in any of the networks in the Kentucky area or nationally, if you would put the name of that network in the chat, that would be great. And if you are interested, just put something like "yes, interested in networking" in the chat box, and that will be helpful for us as well. So I wanted to talk today, we're going to be talking a lot about cultural heritage networks. We're going to be talking about art sector networks, but I wanted to spend just a few minutes on one more type of network, and that is disaster networks in the emergency management sector. And we have a number of things listed here. You can see on the right side, the FEMA regional VALs, and those are voluntary agency liaisons, and their job is to provide advice and guidance and to work with all voluntary agencies active in a disaster. On the left side, you'll see some more groups that coordinate those voluntary agencies. The National VOAD is Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, and this group oversees the whole, from the Red Cross to the Salvation Army to a multitude of charitable and faith-based groups. We see that groups that either give funds or volunteer post-disaster in the US and some all over the world are involved in the National VOAD. There are also state VOADs, and please check to see if your state has one of these. Each state has one. Some are more active than others. COADs, it feels like alphabet soup here, but I wanted to explain this one as well. This is community organizations active in disasters. Check to see if your community has one of these. These often arise after long-term recovery groups finish their active stages after disasters, and they keep networked through a COAD. So do a Google search to see if one of those is available near you. And the long-term recovery groups. These are important. They're created during the recovery period in an area, and they bring together all of the voluntary organizations active in disaster that are active in a specific recovery. It's a means to talk and to coordinate, to plan and figure out how to sort of best divvy up what they're doing to serve as many people and organizations as possible. And some of these also take on the task of giving funds to those whose needs couldn't be met by FEMA. So in Kentucky, take a look if these organizations are in action and if they are continuing on following the tornadoes and floods that have happened within the state. And finally, State Office of Emergency Management. And I know that we have had a number of people who we have worked with and talked with in Kentucky's OEM. So having those folks on your disaster plan list and being able to work with them is very important. Okay, so with that information, back to our support infrastructure for the activities you'll see in the cultural heritage sector and the arts sector. In cultural heritage, I really started working for 30 years in the cultural heritage field. So I'll be talking with you today about some of those networks that have been developed. And they focus a lot more, I would say, on the things, the objects, the books, and making sure that they're preserved and conserved in the event of a disaster. And on the other side, with the arts sector, what we see there is a focus on building and maintaining this sort of nationwide safety net for artists, arts organizations, and arts businesses in all phases of disasters. There are a lot of groups that are under this umbrella. They can be organizations, including service organizations, and those with or without facilities. It's for nonprofit and for-profit organizations. And we look at emotional, financial, and property-related needs because, of course, there are some business continuity issues and resource management that needs to be considered as well in these networks. For the cultural heritage sites, like museums, libraries, archives, etc., their business wouldn't even exist if it weren't for the physical, tangible objects. So much of their emergency preparedness and response measures and networks revolve around keeping those objects safe, whether they are tangible physical objects or they are objects that are digital. So we just wanted to talk a little bit about the differences between the support infrastructures here. On our next slide, I'm going to move into one of those great tools from NCAPER. And Jan and I actually ran around the state of California for a couple of weeks in 2019 talking about the cultural placekeeping guide and network model. This tool was conceptualized in 2015 and published in June 2017. And it's a step-by-step guide about how to create a cultural placekeeping network. Now, for some of you, this term might be new, but it's related to both creative placemaking and creative placekeeping. And it's about the cultural sector making its place more secure and results from networking among members and rooting itself more deeply in its wider community. It's developing, and this is something you'll hear throughout the day today, it's developing connections to necessary support sectors that will be there in blue sky times when disasters aren't happening, and in rainy sky times like we're having here in Ohio, where we do need to see a network when a disaster happens. And the notion of aiding the community after the disaster through arts and culture is important as well. And what we think about that is the idea of arts being sort of the level of the third responder. We have the first responder of police and fire. We have second responders, which may be some of these BOADs and COADs, and we are in there as well. So this is really a culmination of thinking evolution of a model based on experience, a shift from creating an arts response system after disaster and a hub and spoke model to a network model that's active in all phases if you want it to be. This has been built on the experience of the Culture Aid Network in New York City, which is a group that is now in the midst of reinventing itself with other New York institutions, but it's for before, during, and after disasters. It's a flexible, adaptable model from a group of artists or arts organizations or cultural heritage organizations in a district to a state. And what you can see is there is the core activity, there are members of this group, and then you see a much wider field of beneficiaries. And at the core with the group is the way it interacts with the community and interacts with emergency management professionals. You'll see on this key that there are a lot of different activities that are thought of here. Organization in advance, organization of the resources that are out there, organization of different players in a recovery and how they can work together. This connectedness and communication, having the backdrop, having this safety net that we've talked about again and again throughout this whole series of activities. Information goes both in and out. And the information in is finding out organizations that are in a certain area and getting sort of an inventory of all those organizations, maybe mapping those organizations. And then when a disaster happens, the information out portion is very, very important, getting information out for recovery. This is a way to really have coordination that you might not have without a network, have a way that organizations can work together so people aren't sort of double delivering a bunch of things. It's a way to communicate and coordinate, and when you need to mobilize. So let me talk about a couple of the steps in the next slide here that we might think of. There are these communication and coordination services where information is disseminated, communication with stakeholders is done, everyone from constituents or members to the disaster management and arts and culture sector. And it's really a way to have a communication plan during, again, the blue sky and the gray sky times. But some of the actions and services that can be taken by a cultural placekeeping network are assessment after a disaster, mitigation, preparedness, and readiness activities, helping people develop plans, community recovery through arts and culture, again, a theme that we've talked about a bit, education, advocacy, research, and then finding grants, loans, and financial resources, which we know are very important when a disaster happens. Are there in-kind goods and services that can be offered? And fundraising for network activities in any phase. That's something to help keep these networks going. Can you get grants, or can you have some level of underwriting by an organization to help on this? So with those ideas in mind, the steps are here. This guide has exercises to help you think through how to do each of these activities, how to assess your risks, determine who should be in the network, and who your beneficiaries are. So, you think about assembling and organizing the group and who it will serve, who's the audience. When will the network operate? Hopefully 24/7, 365, but really going into overdrive when a disaster happens. Those network actions, which of the things on the slide before would you like to do? Creating a communications plan, letting people know that you're out there. And then what are network action plans, both for the gray skies and blue sky times? you'll see way down the list here, develop and draft a statement of purpose. You really need to think about all of those audiences and activities before I think you put this statement of purpose down on paper and out on your website. Plan for contingencies. Even disaster networks need plan Bs or backup plans. So are you going to have people who can fall in behind in line if an organization is underwater and if an organization is hit by a tornado? The structure of the network, defining membership and signing those folks up is important in step 9, and institutionalizing the network. Again, a step that many people say, oh, we've got to do this at first. But I think this idea of governance structure and protocols is something that you can work into, and putting your ideas about audience and all those other areas into play beforehand, I think can be very helpful. And then maintaining the network. And this can be, and this is what Amanda, I think, was alluding to, the sharing experiences and stories can be somewhat difficult at times. And why should this continue to exist? Why should we maintain it? So the idea of having continuing ed programs on a regular basis, the idea of having continuing communications online or other ways is important as well. So these are some of the steps that organizations talk about. I want to bring Performing Arts Readiness Networks grants to your attention. We've given funding for 14 new or expanded networks in 2017 through 2019, our first grant, 2020 through 2022, our second grant from the Mellon Foundation. And what we did here was, in many cases, there might have been existing networks developed through Elaina's program, the Alliance for Response, or other types of initial funding. And we said, can arts organizations join those, and can we give some expanded funds so things can be aimed to the arts organizations as well? And they've been for metropolitan areas, state networks, but smaller cities and counties as well. One of the most interesting networks that we've been developing and working with is in the Eureka, California and Northern California area. We have funding available for these networks at performingartsreadiness.org grants. We have individual institution disaster plan funding, but we also have up to $25,000 for networks to develop. And Leah will be talking about some of the plans that are moving forward for the potential development of a network in Kentucky. But I also wanted to mention that if you could look at state grants, foundation grants, and federal grants like the National Endowment for the Humanities Preservation Assistance grants, those can be great sources of funds to help your organization develop its disaster plan and preservation plan, but also to look at the idea of a whole bunch of organizations networking together. Now, I see that there's something going on in Q&A. Any tips for starting up the initial community outreach and engagement? And I will answer this at this point. I think Elaina will talk a lot about this, but what I've seen as well is, unfortunately, these disaster networks grow when there has been a disaster that has happened. And so people will say, we want to be able to band together for the next time. That's what we're seeing in the nascent work in Kentucky. That's what we have seen across the country in many areas, from Savannah, Georgia to New Orleans. So that is one thing. And I think the other thing is just to start getting a bit of an inventory of the organizations around your area that deal in arts and culture, and reaching out to those people as much as possible would be a good direction to go. So I hope that answers that question. And finally, what I wanted to mention here was just a few of the PAR resources. We said that this is going to be a session on the idea of resilience and some resources. And for PAR, we have outreach and community engagement, like the kind of work we're doing with this webinar series. Information resources. We have news that comes up on our social media, case histories that are out there, and sample plans on our website. Our circuit rider project is setting up half-time staff to work in a state or an area, to do everything from one-on-one consulting to, unfortunately, a lot of our circuit riders have had to answer the call and be on site at things like a roof collapse from a snowstorm, at other types of disasters. The templates and tools that we have are the D-Plan Arts Ready automated disaster planning tool, and we have a loss of income calculator tool. I've talked about this, I think I might have talked about with this group before, but it is very effective. I mentioned it again because we call it the board scaring tool, and it really tells about the number of people your organization can hold if you're a theater, what the ticket price is, and what the cost would be if you were closed for a number of days. And this can be very effective to getting the board to say, oh, yes, you do need to develop a plan. And I think that you can look at that in the library, archive, museum field by how many people you would miss serving if you were closed for a long time. We have training and conference programming. We have 20 different webinars that are available, usually 3 or 4 times a year, taught by a live instructor, but always available 24/7, 365 online. We have recorded versions. I mentioned the disaster network funding, and there's also disaster planning funding as well. And then since 2020, we've had some special focuses on festival safety. We have a program called the Art of Mass Gatherings that is really an embedded type of training for festival safety. And we've also done some festival safety assessments just starting in 2023. And one of those was at the Lower Town Festival in Paducah in May. And then we have individual institution disaster planning grants as well. Arts administration programs, we work closely with Leah and University of Kentucky's program and do some guest presentations there, but work with about 15 to 20 arts programs around the country. And finally, working with emergency managers. This is something that Jan has really made a mainstay of our services, and we work really closely presenting to emergency management groups so that they can understand the kind of things that we're doing as well. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to hand things over to Elaina, who's going to talk more about networks.
Great, thank you, Tom. So Alliance for Response, I know that I mentioned Alliance for Response in our first meeting all together during the preparedness conversation, but wanted to expound a little bit on AFR today as it relates to resources and network building. So AFR is one of FAIC's key emergency programs. The goals for Alliance for Response are to build relationships, to educate our 2 sectors, so cultural heritage and emergency management sectors, and then to both develop and sustain networks. The program's strengths include building relationships, learning to speak each other's languages, which is everything from decoding different acronyms to kind of understanding the incident command system, which is a unifying language that the arts and culture sector can benefit from knowing. Sharing essential information in advance, so understanding what your facilities have in them, if there are hazards that you should share, if there are different intricacies that you as staff know that your local emergency management partners may not know, having that information to share. And then sustained planning collaboration, so figuring out ways to both get your network in place and then keep it going. And we at FAIC have different resources to help that process. So this map shows the locations of networks we've helped form over the past 20 years. So the AFR initiative began in 2003, and since 2003, we've helped over 30 locations, both regions and states, set up networks. In 2022, we added Chicago and Charleston, and then in 2023, actually last weekend, we added New Hampshire, and in 2024, we will add Arizona. So there are 2 ways to be embedded in FAIC's AFR initiative. First, we work with regions interested in establishing networks through a formal process with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So for example, right now, we know that over the next 2.5 years, we're helping New Hampshire and Arizona This process requires a lot of advanced planning. So we knew in early 2022 which regions we were going to work with in 2023 and 2024. And then in 2025, we're going to work on the next set of network building. So for networks that don't fit into that timeline, there are other groups that get themselves together separate from FAIC, but then they can be part of our umbrella later on if they commit to becoming member networks, which really just entails filling out an annual survey about their network needs and then sharing leadership information with us on an ongoing basis. So for example, there is a network forming in Spokane, Washington right now. They are organizing their network separately from us because they wanted to do it quicker than 2026. But they have been brought into our larger umbrella this year and receive the same benefits as every other AFR network. So I say all this to say that as Kentucky organizes a network, you all are welcome to become a member network whenever the time is right and you're ready. So resources. AFR is a program that's defined by its local connections and what can come from building networks of support. So by becoming part of AFR, you both join a local community and then this larger national level community as well. So here you can see a screenshot of the webpage, culturalheritage.org/AFR. This is the page listing all of the networks that are currently active. On each page, each blue linked page there, you're going to get information about the leadership within the network, different activities the network has completed. So a kickoff forum that they've held for their members, any sort of resources they've compiled as a network, it's all going to be there. We also host an online community for the general AFR network. So anybody who's associated with a network around the country can access this community. That's kind of our central communication platform. And there we share information about, like, for example, if Seattle Alliance for Response is hosting a webinar that other networks could benefit from, they'll post the information there and then anybody can get access to it. And we also, FAIC, we started a couple of years ago hosting the Alliance for Response Advisory Committee, which is a changing group of people every 3 months, but quarterly we host meetings where each network is invited to send 2 people. It could be the chairs, it could be any other person associated with the network. And we focus on one topic. So our last meeting, we focused on governance and bylaws. So networks that have been around for a while, how did they set up their structure? What's their leadership look like? How do they keep everything going? And each network is invited to share, and then we put the recordings in this general online community. So we have other resources as well that we offer. We have small stipends that we offer networks on a yearly basis to help with one activity. It could be getting supplies for your region or having a learning opportunity for your members. But our big goal over the next few years is just getting our various networks connected to each other and to us. And we have a lot of different ways that we're doing that. So if anybody is interested in exploring this more, has questions or thoughts, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Elaina. I know that we will, from the Kentucky area, be reaching out to you as we continue planning for the statewide network, which I'm happy to be talking to you all about today. Just briefly, I wanted to give a little background about the Department of Arts Administration and how we are involved in the emergency management cycle. We, back in 2018, launched the first full semester degree-bearing course in emergency management as it relates to the arts. And that particular course has been such a popular course in the program that now we are launching next year graduate and undergraduate certificates in this area, with more courses available for those that are in the degree-bearing programs, either the bachelor's or master's program. But also we're piloting right now continuing education courses for the public. So these are non-degree courses that are self-led and online for individuals throughout the state. But a little bit about the emerging network called KERN, Kentucky Heritage Emergency Response Network. Over the past 2 years, of course, most of you, if you are based in Kentucky, know that Kentucky has had a number of federally declared disasters. And through the leadership, through Ruth Bryan with the university, who is also the president of Kentucky Council on Archives, and Emily Moses with the Kentucky Arts Council, and Melissa Bond with the university's extension service and other cultural organizations throughout the state. They have activated to help build community engagement and technical assistance to the flooding events in Eastern Kentucky and the tornado event in Western Kentucky about almost now 2 years ago. And now there is a want to formalize this network so that it can function not just in times of disaster, but as I know Tom and Jan say, the blue skies time. And right now, the founding members of this network that have been working over the past 2 years to provide assistance on the ground locally, if we could go to the next slide, you'll see the list of the members there that range from state agencies to more local agencies. And of course, there's a presence from the university based on some of the resources we are able to provide throughout different counties in the state. And we're also glad to have a federal agency through DOI, the Department of the Interior, on this network already as well. So the activities that are being explored, if you remember Tom's screenshot from the Cultural Placekeeping Guide, we're sort of looking at numbers 4, 5, and 6 now. I think we've done 1, 2, and 3 over the past 2 years. And so we'd like to figure out what resources and assistance we can provide in times of disaster. We're considering a hotline that is available right now via email, but hopefully this could be a more robust hotline statewide for either individual organizations and institutions, or even artists, individual artists that are needing assistance. And then in those blue skies time, we're looking at conducting trainings in the emergency management cycle, preparedness, response, and recovery, giving access, free access to the D plan, which I know has been mentioned as the nation's online disaster planning tool for arts and cultural organizations. We also are wanting to host convenings to look at strategic planning to make sure that the network is meeting the needs of various arts and cultural communities throughout the state, and then to be able to provide on-site technical assistance through consulting. In terms of what's available right now, there are some wonderful guides that you can download, and I know Jan mentioned these links are going to be available to you all. Right now, there are 3 guides in these 3 areas of how to navigate relief, submit claims, and assess damage after a disaster event. Also, there's a guide on preparedness and another in mental health and disaster recovery, which I'll be talking about just in a minute a little bit more. There's also another one coming out on collections and how to have a toolkit ready for preserving and recovering and salvaging collections that'll be out probably in the next 2 weeks. So those are great resources that you can access right now. Also regarding funding, particular to the state of Kentucky, of course, the Kentucky Humanities Council and Kentucky Arts Council have done an amazing job of providing relief assistance through their grant programming, but also, you know, the local and regional community foundations are a great resource, because a lot of the national organizations and state organizations, you know, they have assistance that kind of can be there in the immediate aftermath, but then when in the long-term recovery, it can take months to years, and these local and regional foundations can be great for providing assistance during that phase of recovery. So I have been honored to be working on a case study. I've been interviewing, doing focus groups, and we've launched a survey to determine the impacts of the recent disasters particularly the tornadoes in Western Kentucky and the flooding in Eastern Kentucky, on arts and culture communities. And the outcome of this is ideally to inform state agencies, federal agencies, and even local agencies on how to better support arts and culture communities. But one of the big findings that's emerging from this study is the recovery needs on mental health for artists, for cultural managers, for arts managers. Some things that are emerging is this inability to create art in the aftermath of a disaster event, which affects the livelihood of artists who need that income to support their families and their businesses. But also on an organizational end, their staff are dealing with the acute trauma of helping individuals through their organization, but some of them personally have also been affected by the disaster event. So navigating the trauma and how to return to normalcy takes time for staff members, and that can be a challenge for a cultural leader to know how to navigate that with their staff. So I bring this up because I'm hopeful that in the future we will have more specific tools and resources in mental health recovery for arts and culture. But right now there are some great resources if you know of individuals that are needing some additional assistance. BetterHelp has offered 3 months of free therapy for flood victims in Eastern Kentucky. Also, there are some national organizations that provide 24/7 free disaster distress, emotional distress therapy. You can see that with the Red Cross as well. And then on the next slide, you'll see that there is also for those in more extreme emotional distress, there's a suicide hotline that is free and confidential. And I also want to highlight Music Cares. I know Jan mentioned this. This is the Grammys nonprofit arm, but they for many years have been providing financial assistance and well-being assistance to those in the music industry. And there is a specific program for mental health and addiction recovery. And I wanted to list the email and phone number for their program as well. So thank you. And I think now we're going to Jan.
Thanks, Leah. Well, I wanted to end on a positive note, and I was the one putting together the slide. We're going to end with a story of how a small town in upstate New York was able to reinvent itself and really recover after a devastating event, natural occurrence, which we called Hurricane Agnes. Apparently, by the time it got to Corning, which is in the southern Finger Lakes, right over it's only maybe 15 miles from the Pennsylvania border, a very rural area of New York, Steuben County, which is where Corning is located. Corning is, I think, the largest city in Steuben County, and it's 11,000 people. We have, and the county's huge, it's bigger than the state of Rhode Island, and we have more cows than people. So it's very, very rural and not typically what you think of when people say, oh, you're from New York. Well, yeah, but it's not New York City. So this picture was taken on the upper right. Can we go back? Yeah. On the upper right is Market Street, which is what you would consider Main Street, Corning. It's 5 blocks, and at that time, it was 5 blocks of bars and men's shoe stores. And when I was young, I was only allowed in one area, which is where the shoe stores were, and it was pretty awful. And Tropical Storm Agnes had devastating effects in the southern tier, but in some ways it was a blessing to Corning. It delivered 7 inches of precipitation between June 20th and the 25th in 1972, causing the Chemung River and associated waterways to overflow protective dikes that were in place. The magnitude of devastation can be gauged by the facts that more than 6,000 people were displaced. Now that's a population of 11,000. More than half were displaced. 18 unfortunately died, and property damage exceeded $230 million, and that was 51 years ago money. So flooding apparently wasn't new to Corning, although I didn't remember it. So throughout the years in the late 1800s, and then the worst of all was in 1946, there was a flood, and each previous situation had broad attempts at flood control. The 1946 flood really prompted both the state of New York, Pennsylvania, and federal agencies to develop corrective plans and construct 2 dams along the Tioga and Susquehanna rivers. And that work was underway, but unfortunately it was incomplete in 1972. And the Tioga River flows north, so all the water that had been in this slow-moving storm up the Susquehanna brought all that extra water, which is what devastated everything. And in terms of more than 400 homes were destroyed during the storm, 1,500 more were condemned, and 2,500 were flooded but survived. So they said 60% of everything in Corning was inundated. The city was without power and water, of course, and the hospital had to be evacuated. They're all familiar things that we have been seeing and around the world. But in the Glass Museum, which is what Corning was noted for, had 15 feet of flood water. But the worst part was there was a railroad bridge that they put 15 gondolas whole parked on it to weigh it down. Unfortunately, it gave way to the current, and now you had all this added poundage that really destroyed everything beyond it. So the lower right-hand corner is actually a cover of a CD that was done by the Arts of the Southern Finger Lakes on the 40th anniversary of Agnes. And what it was is we had a 800 number that anybody could call in and talk about their experiences before and after and during the flood. And we curated it so that it would be in the voices of the people who went through it, exactly how devastating it was, and you know, the effects. And I have to tell you, the mental health, stress diseases like cancer and diabetes are all on the rise after such devastation. It's 51 years later, but there's still a lot of residual devastation as well. But on the next slide is actually more blue sky time. This is Market Street on the left currently. And but I just wanted to say that because when you're talking about rebuilding and resilience, you don't want to go back to the way you were necessarily. You really want to, using a term that we've all heard, but build back better. And actually the story of Corning began before the flood. And there was a group of Corning Glassworks wives, which we affectionately called the Queens Without Countries. And they would began to advocate, and this is in the 60s, really, for anyone who would listen or even not listen, any group, they really said, we have to revitalize downtown. This is when the movement for shopping malls was going on, which has killed a lot of downtown small towns. And they really said, we have beautiful terracotta buildings from late 1800s. And now they're all covered with aluminum siding, there are neon signs, drunks going up and down the street. I mean, the old thing was to try to get from one bar to the next. To go to every bar on Market Street, you couldn't do it. because there were so many of them. So anyway, these Teens Without Countries had made some progress, and in just 3 months before, in March, the foundation of the Corning Glass gave a grant to the city to establish a 21-person committee to plan the revitalization of Market Street. And interesting, the part of this, the building on the right is actually, it's not on Market Street, it's just around the corner. It was City Hall. And part of the revitalization was to get the City Hall into a more accessible building. So what this became is the Rockwell Museum of Western Art, which is now part of, it's a Smithsonian Associate. So you now have Corning Museum of Glass, but you also have this national treasure in the Western Art building. And what happened was they hired, part of this committee decided, we're going to bring in a Norman Mintz, who is a respected New York City preservation architect, to really give the advice, use the funds to give building owners free advice and free actual plans to bring their buildings back to the way they were. And all the you see on the left, all those buildings were brought back, terracotta and the color, and brick walkways. And there was a centerway now where people can congregate, and we do sparkle for Christmas and all this stuff. It's a real community gathering place. It's beautiful and it's vibrant. And that's what Teens Without Countries, that was their goal, and it still continues. So on the last slide, you see, this is the Corning Museum of Glass. Okay, what do we see? It is on stilt. Remember, it was under 15 feet of water. So although all these mitigation efforts have been going on in Pennsylvania and New York to try to control these floodwaters, the people of Corning said, okay, but we're not willing to bet on that, you know, for 500 years. So when the museum was redone, it was put on stilt. And as a reminder that it will happen again. So we need to be prepared. And I'm proud to say that my hometown was just ranked out of the 14 best small towns to visit in the United States. Corning was rated number 2. And just as a little commercial, Corning has long been at the forefront of all things glass, from innovative technology and science, light bulbs for Thomas Edison, who selected Corning for doing his light bulb, and modern wonders like fiber optics and Gorilla Glass, all done by Corning. And then, of course, the remarkable Museum of Glass, which is the world's largest museum of glass art and artifacts. So it just tells you 51 years later, we all think, having grown up there, the flood was the best thing that ever happened to Corning. And if you can get through all of that and feel the same way after you go through all your recovery efforts, and you'll become more resilient and be able to handle whatever comes along. So the last slide is our information, and we're now able to take more questions if you have them, and everybody can join me on this, not just.
Jan, I was going to say, you and I talk about this storm, Hurricane Agnes, a lot. My grandparents' home was downriver in the Susquehanna River Valley of Northeast Pennsylvania in the Scranton Wilkes-Barre area. And as an 11-year-old kid, I helped get some of their family treasures out of their house that actually had 4 feet of water on the second floor. So it was completely filled with water. And I think ever since then, I've been interested in disaster preparedness and recovery. So it taught a lot of people a lot of things. And I'm so glad that you're able to bring up that story, everything from the recordings about the 40th year to what's going on now in the 50th year and beyond. So thank you for that.
And the arts was, thank you, Tom. The arts were really critical. Not only was Norman, obviously being an architect, he was very sensitive to art. Well, because of the vacant buildings, they encouraged artists to develop live work spaces in these buildings, and they helped with the remodeling. They had to put some skin in the game, and there's still Trix, which is the hot glass company, still is in the building that it started out, and you can buy wonderful things there right on Market Street. You don't even have to go to the museum. So it really was art focused in the recovery, and I think that's important because it brought a lot more people downtown living and working.
And, I think and hope that the same thing might happen in Kentucky. So many organizations and so many businesses in the state are arts and culture related. And I know in Western Kentucky, where the tornadoes hit, the Ice House Gallery is one that was destroyed, but is trying to come back using different places to do its shows and activities right now, but may come back with its own building later. And, I know that in the flooding areas of Eastern Kentucky, we may see some of this as well. So this idea of arts being the rallying point, the sort of rallying cry for recovery is certainly really important. And it's something that Jan and I talk about a lot at the time.
And local leadership, I don't think I said this, but it was a public-private partnership, but I'll tell you, it was the Corning leaders, and it was that 21 person committee and an appointed person from the Glassworks, which happened to be my uncle, they directed FEMA. This is what we need. This is what we want. And actually, FEMA people loved it because, okay, they know what they want. We're here to help in every way we can, but we can't make those decisions. And I think we all have to remember solutions are done locally. And you might get help from elsewhere, but it's really your own input and work that makes it successful.
I just want to add too, I feel like we are seeing more and more this like local or state collaboration with the federal level groups, including FEMA, with the flooding that just occurred in Vermont earlier this summer. An AFR network there, their acronym is VACDARN, and it stands for Vermont Arts and Culture Disaster and Resilience Network. There it is. Anyway, they worked closely with FEMA to coordinate efforts amongst institutions and the public, and FEMA's Save Your Family Treasures program, they worked with VACDARN to be able to inform the public on how to salvage their things and safeguard them for future events. So I really think that the power of networks is being felt certainly locally, but also it's helping inform that federal level work, which is great to see.
And a lot of the techniques that you use in recovery were developed after Agnes, because Corning had all these scientists with nothing to do. And so they figured out, oh, well, you could put this in a microwave, you could put this in a cold storage or whatever. And so a lot of the stuff that or the techniques that you use really came out of people trying to figure out how to save and salvage.
I see that, and there was a question about, for those in Kentucky that are interested in being part of this network of Kern as it's formalizing, and I just would like to say, please reach out to me at my email, l.hamilton@uky.edu, and we will get you connected, because the more we can have partners on the network, the stronger this network will be, for sure. So
I don't see that we have any more questions or anything else in the chat. I wanted to just say a couple of things before closing. One thing is that our colleague, someone who works very closely with Elaina and is an expert in the field, Vicki Lee, she will be presenting at the Kentucky Library Association conference in October, and she'll be doing a live demonstration of some of the ways you can recover different types of materials. So that's one area. We've also had a request to put the contact slide up again. If we could go back to that slide for just a minute, and I know that that will be sent out. We want to definitely thank you for participating today and throughout the series. And we will have the recording from the session on the kyhumanities.org website. And we'll send out the link to the download as soon as we have it complete and uploaded. And the other thing will be that there will be an evaluation, I believe, for today's session and for the series as well. Thanks to everyone for attending. Thanks, Leah, for joining and giving the Kentucky flavor to the resources today. And Jan and Elaina, it's been great to work with you throughout the series and work with Kentucky Humanities Council. So thanks again. And now we'll turn it over to Bill for our closing.
Thanks to Jan, Tom, and Leah for their insights, and to our sponsor, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and to the many individuals and organizations that shared photos and video footage, our sincere appreciation. We also want to thank you for joining us for this Disaster Preparedness online series session, and encourage you to fill out our survey immediately following this event. If you're interested in reviewing the information covered in today's session, you'll be able to find a recording at kyhumanities.org or on our Kentucky Humanities YouTube channel. For Kentucky Humanities, I'm Bill Goodman.